Welcome to Ask Fear and Greed, where we take your questions and do our best to answer them. I'm Michael Thompson, and good afternoon, Sean Aylmer.
Good afternoon, Michael.
Sean, got a great question for you today. Well, I don't have it personally. It has come from a listener by the name of Locky, who sent it in via Facebook. And if you've got your own question, then Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, or the website, fearandgreed.com.au. You can use any of those means to get your question through to us. Locky has done that, and he says, "Morning, team. A question for your next Ask Fear and Greed, if it makes the cut." And Locky, it has made the cut. "I understand that most of the countries or economies in the world are in debt. Singapore and some of the Scandinavian countries are an exception, I think." He says, "If that's the case, who has all of the money? Is there more debt? This is interesting. Is there more debt than credit in the world? How is it reconciled?" I don't know. Look, Locky, the short answer from me is no idea. I'm going to hand over to Sean for this one.
Well, let's think about this. So governments borrow money to fund all the spending that taxes don't pay for. We're talking huge numbers here. So I think the United Nations puts global public debt at close to $100 trillion US. And some of the fastest growth rates are coming from developing countries. So you're certainly having more spending than saving. Generally, there was a very big jump during and after COVID when governments went on a spending spree, or governments all over the place went on spending sprees to keep economies ticking over. So that kind of increased all this public debt. So where does the money come from? Well, it comes from big institutional investors like superannuation funds. It also comes from other countries. So countries lend money to each other, and from international agencies like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. Now, those two, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, mostly they're dealing with underdeveloped nations. Government debt is repaid over time, might be 3 years, 10 years, 30 years. Now, when we talk about the 10-year government bond yield on the show, we are talking about government debt. That's exactly what that is. And governments pay back the debt in increments. So they might pay a quarterly coupon rate, or probably more likely a half-yearly coupon rate, or annually. So they borrow the money at 5%. They pay back that 5%, 2.5% each half year as they go forward. So that's kind of familiar to us.
At the risk of trying to oversimplify things here, Sean, is it a bit like how we repay our mortgages?
Yes. That's kind of exactly what it is. Not oversimplifying it at all, but there's a really big difference when it comes to government debt versus your mortgage, my mortgage. Mm-hmm. Countries can raise taxes or issue more of their own currency to help pay back debt.
So you're saying I can't print money on my
on
my Epson printer, take it into the bank and say, "Here's my payment for August."
Unfortunately, you can't. I mean, that is the big difference between a country issuing debt, is that they can just raise taxes, so they can always pay it back, or at least appear to pay it back. Now, the US government debt is considered safest of all because of that country's ability to tax and raise money. Now, from memory, I think gross debt is about $35 trillion US. We are talking a massive amount. And when I say gross debt, that's actually the amount that it owes. A lot of people would owe the US money, so that's the difference between gross and net debt. Net debt would be a lot less. Certainly, the US budget spends more than it earns, so much more than it gets from taxation receipts. And it has done since 2001. Like the last time the US had a budget surplus was 2001. Debt's usually measured as a percent of output. The big debt nations are the US, Japan's a big one, Italy, Canada, etc. So the question is, how's all that reconciled? So as countries grow, they earn more income, mostly via taxation, and that's used to repay the debts. Think of it, when you got your first home loan, and you got it for $300,000 or $400,000 to buy the apartment.
Yep. And
then you get a better job, you get paid more, you end up getting a bigger house, and then you get another job and you get a promotion. It's kind of think of it that way in terms of countries growing.
Okay.
So what the debt they take out initially, they end up earning more income and are able to repay it. So like a good example in Australia, when there's a mining boom, all this extra revenue comes through the door, and Australia can repay down its debt. And it has done that over the years. In fact, under the Howard Costello government, it kind of repaid all its debt. It's a never-ending cycle. So, is there a complete reconciliation point? Probably not. I mean, countries just keep raising debt and keep repaying, and it goes on and on and on. Now, sometimes you hear of countries defaulting, not being able to repay their debt. Ghana did it a couple of years ago. A bunch of African countries have done it. Argentina did it. In fact, the World Economic Forum reckons 147 governments, not necessarily nation governments, but governments, have defaulted on debts since 1960, and the vast majority of those come from underdeveloped nations. So the bottom line to this, who has all the money? Well, it's kind of a circular economy, because the money that's owed to super funds or other governments or international agencies like the IMF and World Bank is repaid, but more debts are taken out. And so I don't think we ever get to a net zero, and I'm sure we would never get to a net zero. Is there more debt than credit in the world? It's a good question. I think because governments can print money and raise taxes, there probably is more debt than credit in the world. But I'm going to ask Kook about that one, because you actually have to have the money to borrow it, or someone has to have the money to borrow it. So I'm not quite sure about that one. I might have to ask Kook about that one.
I tell you what, we get some good questions, don't we?
Yes. And they're never simple. I mean, great thing about economics and finance, it's often when you talk to these professionals and you actually ask these sorts of questions that like Locky asked today, they don't know the answer to themselves. Like, it's sort of just assumed. And so when you actually dig into it, it becomes quite fascinating.
You know what we should do one day is a Ask Fear and Greed live show where we take where we take questions from a live audience, and there is no research.
Yeah.
No preparation.
Any ability to use Google on the spot?
Yeah, you just have to answer with the first thing that comes into your head. That's pretty much what I do on this podcast, really. That would be a challenge, wouldn't it? And you see, that's kind of then when you see people like the Kook as well, who kind of deals with all of these questions as well, like on a fairly regular basis. What would it take to stump the Kook? Maybe that's a good segment. Stump the Kook. See if you can come up with the curliest question you possibly can.
Like that. Yeah.
Anyway, great answer. Very comprehensive. I'm surprised. The thing that actually probably surprised me most is the number of governments that have defaulted on their debts.
Yeah, I was surprised. Yeah, like countries like Spain, not in decades and decades, I mean, probably hundreds of years, but Spain was famous for defaulting on debt. So, like I'm going to get the dates wrong, but it might have been the 15 and 1600s. A lot of those European monarchs, they just kept defaulting. And so, sometimes you see those TV shows and they're talking about, how much money do we have? And they're always defaulting in the old days.
Oh, now we've turned into a history lesson. Is there anything that you do not know, Sean?
Anything that I can't make up, Michael? No, I'll make up anything.
Perfect. We have been doing these shows long enough that I'm starting to rub off on you. Ooh,
Well, we are close, Michael. We are close.
Goodness me. All right. Thank you very much, Locky, for the question. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael. Remember,
if you've got something that you would like to know, then please send through your question on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or at fearandgreed.com.au. I'm Michael Thompson, and this is Ask Fear and Greed.